My mom slammed her hand on the table and yelled, "Hand over your inheritance check right now. Your brother needs it more." I threw down the bank transfer receipt and shouted, "Touch one more dollar and my lawyer files the fraud report tomorrow." I still remember the sound of her palm hitting the table because the whole apartment went quiet for half a second afterward. I had just gotten home from a 10-hour shift. My shoes were still on, and I was holding a folder from the bank because I had gone straight there after work. My mother looked at me like I had personally robbed her when all I had done was refuse to hand over money that was legally mine. My brother was standing behind her with his arms folded, trying to look calm, which was always his trick when he wanted other people to do the dirty work for him. The whole fight started because of an inheritance check from my Uncle Gerald, who had died the winter before after a long stretch of being sick. He had no kids. He never married. He left most of what he had to be split between me and a couple of charities, and the paperwork had taken months because probate always moves like it is stuck in mud. I had helped him more than anyone else when he was still alive. That was not me bragging. It was just the truth. I drove him to appointments. I bought his groceries. I sat in the hospital waiting room with him when my mother was too busy and my brother was too tired. I did not expect any of that to matter when the will was opened, but it did. There was a check coming to me for a little over $53,000. It was not life-changing money, but it was the first real money I had ever been handed without strings attached. I had planned to use it to kill my credit card balance, fix the brakes on my car, and finally stop living one surprise expense away from panic. My mother found out before I even had the chance to deposit it. That was part one of the problem. Part two was that she had already decided my brother needed it more. My brother, Darren, had needed money more or less every year since he was 18. At first it was tuition. Then it was rent. Then it was a truck payment. Then it was a business loan. Then it was some temporary medical emergency that never quite ended. He was the kind of man who could turn a mild inconvenience into a family crisis if he had enough people around him willing to help. My mother was the first person in line every single time. I used to think she was just being a good mom. That was before I started noticing how many of her emergencies involved Darren and how few involved anyone else. The first phone call about the inheritance came the morning the probate lawyer left me a voicemail saying the final distribution packet was ready. My mother called me less than an hour later. She asked if I had spoken to the lawyer yet. I said yes. She asked if I knew how much it was. I said yes again. She went quiet for a beat too long, which should have told me exactly what was coming. Then she said my brother had some things going on and the money should go to him first. Not later, not some of it, first. I remember staring at the wall in my kitchen while the coffee machine clicked itself off behind me. I asked what things. She said rent. She said a truck repair. She said the kids needed stability. She said family helped family, and I was old enough to know that. I told her it was my inheritance and I had already made plans for it. That was the first mistake she never forgave me for. She spent the next 3 days calling me at work, texting me during dinner, and leaving me long voice messages about how selfish I sounded. I did not answer most of them. I have never been good at arguing on the phone, and I knew from experience that once I opened my mouth, she would act like my tone was the real problem instead of the actual request. I figured if I stayed calm, she would cool off. That was my second mistake. People like her do not cool off. They escalate. A week before the dinner confrontation, I got a packet from the probate lawyer in the mail. The envelope was thick enough that I assumed it was just the final check and some tax forms. Instead, I found a distribution statement, a notarized copy of the will, and an itemized summary of the estate account. That is when I saw a line item I was not supposed to see. There had been a withdrawal from Uncle Gerald's estate account for $11,400. The memo line said reimbursement for emergency assistance. The recipient was Darren. I read it 3 times because my brain kept refusing to accept it. The date on the transfer was 2 days after Gerald died. That was impossible unless somebody had used authority they did not have. I sat there at my kitchen table in my work clothes, staring at the paper, while my stomach slowly dropped through the floor. I knew enough about estates to know that weird money movements after death were not something you ignore. I also knew enough about my own family to know my brother would never volunteer an explanation that made him look bad, so I called the probate lawyer. I did not accuse anyone. I did not yell. I just read the line item out loud and asked whether it was normal. The lawyer got very quiet, which was the second sign that something was off. He asked me to email him copies of the packet and any text messages from my mother or brother about the inheritance. He said he would look into it and get back to me. That afternoon, I opened a new savings account in my name only. I did not tell my mother. I did not tell Darren. I went to the bank on my lunch break, showed them my ID, and asked for a cashier's check deposit receipt when the inheritance arrived. I wanted a paper trail the second the money moved. I had learned the hard way that if you ever expected trouble, you kept your own records. My father used to say that paperwork is the only part of a family fight that does not lie. At the time, I thought he was just being dramatic. Now I think he was being generous. The check arrived 4 days later. I deposited it immediately. The teller gave me the receipt, and I stood there looking at it longer than I probably needed to. It was such a simple thing, a slip of paper, a transaction number, a date and time. But I remember feeling a weird sense of relief, like I had put a lock on something before anyone else got their hands on it. That same evening, my mother asked me to come over for dinner. She said it like a normal request, but I could hear the edge underneath it. I almost said no. Then I thought maybe if we talked face to face, the whole thing could be handled before it became one of those long family disasters that poisons every holiday for 10 years. I should have trusted my instinct to stay home. When I got there, Darren was already seated at the table. My mother had cooked too much food, which was one of her habits when she wanted to stage an atmosphere. There was pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, and rolls that sat in a basket no one had touched. The room smelled like onions and pressure. My mother barely said hello. She asked whether I had deposited the check. I said yes. She asked whether I had thought about helping Darren yet. I said no. That was the moment her expression changed. It was small at first, a tightening around the mouth, a little lift of the chin, the kind of look that says somebody has decided you are not going to be reasonable tonight. She told me Darren was behind on rent and his truck had become unsafe to drive. She said he had 2 children depending on him. She said I was single, my bills were manageable, and I could recover from this while he could not. I remember looking at Darren while she said it. He did not deny any of it. He just sat there with that same patient face he wore whenever he wanted other people to fight on his behalf. I asked why the estate statement showed an $11,000 transfer to him 2 days after Gerald died. That got his attention. My mother answered too fast. She said it was for emergency expenses and everyone had agreed. I asked who everyone was. She said the family. I asked when the family had agreed to let estate money go out before probate closed. She told me I was making it more complicated than it needed to be. That was the phrase that finally clicked something into place for me, not the money itself. The phrase. I had heard it before. Every time someone in my family wanted me to stop asking questions, they told me I was making things complicated. It was the verbal version of a hand over the mouth. I put my fork down. I said I had already spoken to the lawyer. My mother paused just long enough for the room to feel heavier. Then she said there was no reason to involve lawyers if we could handle things as a family. I told her the estate account transfer did not look normal. I told her I wanted the records. I told her I was not giving Darren a cent. She took one sharp breath and slammed her hand on the table hard enough to make the silverware jump. That was when she yelled at me to hand over the inheritance check right now because my brother needed it more. The words were so ugly in the room that even now I can still hear them. I did not yell back immediately. I just looked at her. Maybe that annoyed her more than anything else I could have done. Darren started to speak, then stopped. My mother kept going, saying I was making an already hard situation worse, saying family had sacrificed for me, saying I owed my brother for being the one who had always kept peace in the house. That part was almost funny, because Darren had never kept peace in his life. He had just been the one my mother protected. I reached into my folder and pulled out the bank transfer receipt from the deposit. I set it on the table right in front of her, not because I was trying to be dramatic, because I wanted her to understand that I had already moved the money into an account she could not touch. She looked at the receipt like it had insulted her. I told her the money was in my account, under my name only, and if she or Darren touched one more dollar, my lawyer would file the fraud report the next morning. The room went completely still. My mother asked what fraud report. I told her the estate account transfer to Darren had already been flagged and the lawyer was reviewing it. I told her I had copies of the statement. I told her I had texts. I told her I had every receipt. That was the first time I saw real fear in her face, not guilt. Fear. Those are different things. Guilt makes people apologize. Fear makes people calculate. Darren stood up and said I was threatening the family over money I had not even earned. I remember thinking that was an impressive sentence for a man who had not earned most of the money he had ever spent. I still did not raise my voice. I just told him I had helped Gerald when he was alive, and I had watched him die, and I was done letting the family decide that my life only mattered when there was money to redirect. My mother started crying after that, not softly, not in a way that looked natural. She cried the way people do when they realize their usual tricks are no longer working. She said I was cruel. She said Darren had children. She said I was breaking her heart. I packed up my folder, told them I was leaving, and left my untouched dinner on the table. I did not slam the door. I did not say anything satisfying. I went home, locked my apartment, and sat at my own kitchen table until nearly midnight waiting for the anger to hit me. It did eventually, but it was mixed with something else. Doubt. That was the part I hate admitting. I wondered whether I had overreacted. I wondered whether my mother was just scared. I wondered whether Darren really had some desperate situation I did not know about. I hate that this is still true about me even now. When someone raises you to feel responsible for everyone else, it takes effort to stop feeling guilty when you finally say no. So I did what I always do when I am unsure. I started documenting. I printed the estate statement. I saved the email thread with the lawyer. I exported my text messages. I checked my bank app to make sure the deposit had cleared. I copied the transaction ID onto paper and put it in a folder with the rest. I did not tell anybody I was doing this. The next morning, the lawyer called back. His voice had changed from polite to careful. He said there were issues with the estate account that he could not discuss in detail over the phone. He asked whether I knew if my mother had ever had access to Gerald's banking information after his death. I said I did not know, but it would not surprise me. That made him quiet again. Then he asked me to come to his office. I went on my lunch break and told my boss I had a bank appointment. That was technically true. The office was small, cramped, and full of old framed certificates that made it look more confident than it probably felt. The lawyer laid out a printout of the account activity in front of me. There had been more than one transfer. There were also 2 withdrawals from the estate account in the weeks after Gerald died, both labeled as administrative reimbursements. The signatures attached to the requests were shaky enough that even I could tell they had been signed by different hands. The lawyer said the bank had already been contacted. He said one of the transfers appeared to have been initiated through a debit card that should have been destroyed after death. I did not understand that at first. He explained that someone had used a card tied to Gerald's account after he had died. That meant somebody had access they were not supposed to have. He looked at me and asked very carefully whether I wanted to make a formal fraud statement. I remember feeling my face get hot, not because I was angry yet, because I was finally understanding that this was bigger than family drama. This was the sort of thing that gets people visited by investigators. I told him yes. He told me to bring any paperwork I had and not to discuss it with my mother until he finished reviewing the file. That should have been the end of my confusion. It was not, because a few hours later, my brother called me from an unknown number. I nearly let it go to voicemail, but something told me to answer. He sounded weirdly calm. He said Mom was upset and that I needed to stop pushing things. He said the transfer from the estate was temporary, and everyone had assumed I would understand that once I had my own money. He said that with such confidence that I knew immediately he was not telling me the full story. I asked him who approved the transfer. He hesitated just long enough. Then he said Mom handled it. I asked how she handled it if Gerald was already dead when the money moved. He told me not to be difficult. That was the most revealing thing he could have said. People who are innocent do not usually ask you to stop being difficult when you ask where the money went. People who know enough to be nervous say things like you are misunderstanding. People who are guilty say you are making trouble. I wrote that down after I hung up. I wrote down the exact time of the call. I wrote down what he had admitted without meaning to. Then I sent the notes to the lawyer. The next morning, the lawyer asked me to come back. This time there was another man in the office, someone from the bank's fraud team. He introduced himself as if we were in a movie about paperwork, which somehow made the whole thing feel even more real. He showed me copies of the transfer request and the bank card activity. One charge had been made at a gas station 3 days after Gerald's death. Another had been made at a grocery store. A third had been made for a cash withdrawal at an ATM a few miles from my mother's house. My mouth actually went dry. I had not been at the bank when any of that happened. I had been at work. I had been picking up dry cleaning. I had been sitting in traffic. The dates lined up too neatly for me to pretend it was a coincidence. The bank man told me they would be freezing the questionable transactions while the investigation continued. The lawyer told me he was preparing a formal fraud referral. He used the exact phrase I had thrown at my mother the night before. It did not feel triumphant. It felt sickening. Because once you get to that stage, there is no pretending the family fight is about manners anymore. Now it is about records and authority, and whether someone crossed the line into criminal behavior. I remember sitting there thinking about the roast sitting untouched on my mother's table. It seemed stupid that something so ordinary could sit next to something so serious. The bank man asked me whether I had any idea why my mother thought she could use estate money before probate closed. I said yes, and then I paused, because the honest answer was not simple. I knew why she thought she could. She had spent my entire life acting as though whatever she wanted was the same thing as what the family needed. That does something to your head when you grow up inside it. You stop asking whether the plan is fair and start asking whether saying no will make things worse. I left the office with a copy of every page they would legally give me. I also left with a headache that lasted 3 hours. That evening, my mother called 6 times. I did not answer. Then she texted me that Darren was going to lose his truck. Then she texted that his landlord had already posted a warning on the door. Then she texted that I had become cold since getting money. I would be lying if I said that did not make me angry, not because the texts were persuasive, because they were such a perfect example of how she worked. She never argued with the facts. She just kept trying different emotional hooks until one of them landed. The next day was Thursday, and I had my routine messed up from all the meetings. I went to work early, forgot my lunch, and had to buy a sad sandwich from the gas station near my office. I ate it in my car and looked over the fraud packet while parked in a strip mall lot. I am not proud of how ordinary the day felt. That is the thing about this kind of betrayal. Most of it happens in the middle of boring life. You are checking your email, you are buying groceries, you are late for work, and then you find out someone has been moving money like it is a family toy. That evening, my Aunt Denise called. She was Gerald's sister, and she had always been the one family member who said things the blunt way without dressing them up. She asked why my mother had been calling the extended family crying about how I was trying to destroy the family over a death benefit. That made me sit up straight. I asked her what she meant. She said Mom had told half the relatives that I was refusing to help Darren after Gerald had supposedly wanted the family to share the inheritance. I nearly laughed because I knew there was no version of reality where Gerald would have told my mother to give my money to Darren. Gerald had liked Darren, but he had seen through him just fine. Denise said she did not know what was true, but she had heard enough to think there was more going on than a simple disagreement. I told her I would explain later and not over the phone. Then I asked whether Gerald had ever mentioned letting Mom handle his banking. She went quiet for a second and said yes, for a time, when he was too sick to manage things himself. That was the first detail that made the whole thing click into a shape I did not like. My mother had access while Gerald was alive because he trusted her with paperwork during the worst months of his illness. That meant she knew the account numbers, the login information, and probably the card PIN. That also meant she had had the opportunity to keep using them after his death if she wanted to. I called the lawyer back immediately. He asked me to send him Denise's name and what she had said. He sounded more serious than before. He told me that if a person uses access granted during someone's lifetime after that person dies, the bank treats it very differently. He did not use the word criminal yet, but he did not have to. I understood it fine. That night, I pulled every old text I had from the past year. I found messages from my mother asking me to sign an estate document while Gerald was still in hospice. I found one where she said she had been too tired to read the paperwork and needed me to trust her. I found another where she said Darren had already promised to pay money back as soon as business picked up. I had not thought anything of those at the time. Now they looked exactly like what they were. Pieces of a longer story I had been too willing to accept. The next time my mother tried to get me on the phone, I finally answered. I did not do it because I wanted to argue. I did it because I wanted to hear whether she would tell the truth if I gave her one more chance. She did not. She spent the first minute talking about how embarrassed the family was getting. She spent the second minute saying the lawyer was making things more complicated than they needed to be. She spent the third minute saying I should think about my nieces and nephews before I made a permanent mistake. That was when I interrupted her and asked whether she had used Gerald's bank card after he died. Silence. Then she said she did what she had to do. That was the line that ended whatever was left of my patience, not because it was surprising, because it confirmed everything. I asked whether she had moved the $11,000 transfer to Darren. She said Darren had needed help and would pay it back. I asked whether she had filed any of it with the lawyer. She said no one needed to know every little family arrangement. I told her the bank already knew. That got a reaction. She asked me who had told me that. I told her it did not matter. Then I said the fraud report was already in progress. She started crying again, but this time I heard anger under it. She said I was turning on my own mother. I told her she had turned on me first. I told her I was not giving her a single cent. I told her if she or Darren touched my account, the lawyer would handle it. She hung up after that. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone while my hands shook harder than they should have. I was not scared of them. I was angry at how long I had spent trying not to see what was right in front of me. The fraud report was filed 2 days later. I know because the lawyer emailed me the confirmation. The bank had concluded that at least one transfer from Gerald's account had been unauthorized after death. They had also flagged the use of the debit card and the suspicious reimbursement requests. The report included copies of the card activity, the transfer requests, and the text messages I had saved. That is where the paperwork did what family arguments never do. It made the pattern impossible to deny. My mother stopped calling after that. Darren called once to say I was ruining Mom's life over one mistake. I asked him whether he thought using a dead man's bank card was one mistake. He did not answer that directly. He said I had become selfish since getting a little money. I told him there was no money left to argue over because it was in my account and staying there. He said he hoped I was happy. I said I hoped he was ready to pay back what he took. He hung up. For about a week, nothing happened. That was the weirdest part. People who are used to chaos always expect the next explosion to come immediately. Instead, there was just the silence of pending consequences. I went to work. I bought groceries. I paid my electric bill. I checked my bank app every morning like a paranoid old man, even though no one was going to magically pull the money out of my account. Then a certified letter arrived. It was from the probate attorney. My mother had been removed from any access to Gerald's financial paperwork. The estate was being fully reviewed by the bank. Any future contact had to go through counsel. That was the first time I felt actual relief, not happiness. Just relief. Like I had finally been standing up against a wall that might hold. A few days later, Denise called again and told me the extended family had finally heard the actual version of the story from the lawyer's office. Apparently, the explanation spread fast once people saw the bank records. That made me feel awkward more than victorious. I do not enjoy family humiliation, even when the humiliation is deserved. Denise said my mother had told people I had attacked her when she was just trying to keep the family together. She also said a couple of relatives had asked for the documents because they did not believe the whole thing had started over a simple inheritance check. I told her it had not started over the check. It had started over a lifetime of my money being treated as the family's backup plan. That line made her go quiet. She said she understood more than I probably thought. That was the closest anyone got to apologizing for the whole family system we had built around not asking hard questions. A month later, the bank finished its review. They confirmed the unauthorized withdrawal had to be repaid to the estate. That part mattered because it meant Darren could not keep pretending the money had always been legitimate. The bank also refused to honor one of the reimbursement requests because the supporting paperwork was obviously incomplete. My mother did not get arrested. I know some people reading this would probably want a bigger ending than that. Real life is annoying that way. Sometimes the result is not handcuffs. Sometimes it is just that the fraud gets documented, the account gets frozen, and the person who thought they could manipulate the family is forced to sit there and answer for it. My mother hated that worse than arrest, I think, because arrest would have let her become a victim in her own mind. Being forced to repay money and admit she had been wrong robbed her of that story. Darren was furious for a while. Then, because he had always been the practical one when it came to himself. He got quieter. I found out later that part of why he had pushed so hard was that my mother had already told him the inheritance was basically handled, and he should spend ahead of it. That made sense in the ugliest possible way. He had not just wanted my money. He had already treated it like money that belonged to him. He and I did not talk much after that. I do not know whether he believes he was conned by my mother or whether he knows he helped pull the wool over my eyes too. Maybe both. As for my mother, she sent me one letter by mail, not an email, a letter. It was 3 pages long and handwritten in the same dramatic way she used to sign birthday cards when she wanted to look warm. She said she had only ever wanted what was best for the family. She said I was being hard-hearted. She said Darren had really needed the money. She said she had assumed I would understand because I had always been so responsible. That part almost made me laugh. Responsibility in our house had always meant being the person who said yes last. I did not reply to the letter. I showed it to the lawyer instead. He told me not to answer anything in writing unless it went through him. That turned out to be one of the best pieces of advice I got all year. The practical side of all this took longer than the emotional side. I had to wait on the final corrected distribution. I had to file a separate statement with the bank because my mother's actions had extended the timeline. I had to update my own accounts and change a couple of passwords because now I had trust issues in places I never expected to. That part was exhausting. Every official form reminded me that I had spent years assuming the worst thing my family could do was argue. I had not realized how much damage could hide inside routine. By the time the money was fully settled, I had learned more about bank fraud, probate delays, and estate transfers than I ever wanted to know. I also learned something uglier about myself. I had spent so many years trying to be the reasonable one that I kept giving my family extra chances they had not earned. I kept assuming the next explanation would make the previous lie make sense. It never did. The lies just kept getting bigger until the paperwork was strong enough to stop them. Once the money was safe, I used it exactly the way I had planned from the beginning. I paid off my credit cards. I fixed the brakes on my car. I bought new tires because the old ones were starting to show threads and I had been ignoring it. I put the rest into savings and left it alone. I did not buy anything flashy. I did not tell anyone how much was left. I did not lend money to anybody in my family. That last part caused its own little wave of drama, because apparently once one person gets caught stealing from the inheritance pot, everyone else starts acting like the person who refused to share is the villain. I did not care. I had finally reached the point where being disliked felt better than being used. I moved 6 months later into a small one-bedroom closer to work. It was nothing special. The kitchen was older than I would have liked, and the hallway smelled faintly like somebody's laundry detergent no matter how many times the building manager cleaned. But it was mine. No one knew my bank password. No one could show up and announce that I was being selfish if I did not want to finance their bad decisions. That freedom felt better than I expected. My mother tried twice after that to act like nothing had happened. The first time was through a birthday card with extra cash tucked inside. I mailed the cash back. The second time was at a cousin's graduation, where she hovered like she wanted to corner me in the parking lot and force a normal conversation out of me. I kept the interaction short and polite and left before the cake. She never fully recovered from losing control over the money. I think that was the real wound, not the fraud report, not the bank reversal. The fact that the one thing she had used to keep the family orbiting around her stopped working. Darren and I saw each other once at Thanksgiving the following year. He looked older, not by much, just enough to show that stress had caught up with him. We exchanged a few cautious sentences in the kitchen while people pretended not to watch us. He said he knew I thought badly of him. I told him I thought he had let Mom handle things he should have stopped. He nodded like he was accepting a sentence. Then he said he had believed the money would get sorted out and nobody would really get hurt. That line stuck with me because it sounded almost honest. Not good, just honest. I told him that was what all of them had always said, that they thought it would work out, that nobody would get hurt, that somebody else would absorb the damage. He did not argue. Maybe because he knew I was right. I left before dessert again. I have not regretted that. People sometimes ask whether I feel bad that I took the money and cut them off. The answer is no, but that is too simple. I feel bad that it had to get to the point where bank fraud reports and frozen accounts were the only language my family would respect. I feel bad that my mother chose control over honesty. I feel bad that my brother grew into a man who thought other people's inheritance was a community resource. I do not feel bad for keeping what was mine. That part was the easiest decision I ever made. What I feel now is calmer than revenge. It is closer to relief mixed with sadness. I lost the version of my family I kept hoping existed. I gained proof that I was not crazy for wanting boundaries. Those two things happened at the same time, and I think that is why the whole thing still feels strange when I look back on it. I did not win because I insulted anyone better. I did not win because I got lucky. I won because I kept every receipt. I won because I asked for statements. I won because I did not hand over money just because someone yelled louder than I did. I won because the facts were uglier than their story, and eventually the facts spoke first. And I think that is why that night at the table still matters to me. My mother slammed her hand down and expected me to fold like I always had. Instead, I put the paper in front of her and stayed calm long enough for the truth to catch up. That was the first time in my life that not reacting right away actually saved me. It also ended the part of my family that thought my silence meant weakness. I have not been silent with them since.